My true story from Oklahoma. I got them out of debt. Then they moved without telling me. I paid their debts. I saved their home. I did it quietly, because that's what mothers do. But when they moved out, they didn't tell me. I came home to an empty house. That day, I realized, sometimes you need to leave people behind before they leave you. If you've ever been treated like you're invisible by the family you built, subscribe to this channel. Here, we tell the stories they'd rather forget. My name is Martha Ellison, and I'm 74 years old. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, watching wheat fields turn gold every summer and feeling the red dirt under my fingernails from gardening. The thunderstorms here roll across the plains like God's own drumbeat, and I've weathered more of them than I care to count. But this story isn't about the beauty of my home state or the strength you learn from surviving tornado seasons. It's about what happens when the people you love most treat you like furniture. Useful when they need you, invisible when they don't. It started innocently enough, the way most heartbreak does. My son David called me on a Tuesday morning in March, his voice shaking like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. The phone rang at 7:30, just as I was finishing my morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky pink over my neighbor's wheat field. "Mom, we're in trouble," he said without preamble. Real trouble this time. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, the way you do when you know your world is about to shift. David had always been my dreamer, even as a boy. He'd build elaborate castles in the sandbox behind our old house, promising they'd last forever, decorating them with bottle caps and smooth stones from the creek. But when something shinier caught his attention, a butterfly, a friend calling his name, the ice cream truck's distant melody, he'd abandon those castles without a backward glance, leaving me to smooth over the sand and start fresh for tomorrow's dreams. At 42, he was still that same boy, just with a mortgage and a wife who shared his expensive tastes and his talent for living beyond their means. "How much?" I asked, already reaching for my checkbook, though my arthritis made the movement painful. "$37,000, he whispered, and I could hear Karen crying in the background. "The bank says we have 60 days or they'll foreclose." "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do. The kids don't even know yet. How do I tell Emma and Jake that we might lose their home?" I felt my heart skip, then race. $37,000 was more money than I'd ever seen in one place, more than Frank and I had ever spent on anything except our own house 45 years ago. My late husband and I had saved modestly, lived simply, shopped at thrift stores, and grew our own vegetables. We'd raised David in a 2-bedroom house with hand-me-down furniture and home-cooked meals made from whatever was on sale at the grocery store. But love we'd given him in abundance, freely and without conditions. "Mom, I know it's a lot to ask. I know we've already borrowed." "Don't you worry about that," I interrupted, though my voice caught slightly. "Family takes care of family. That's what your daddy always said, and it's what I believe." What I didn't tell him was that my savings account contained exactly $41,000.37. Frank's life insurance policy and the careful accumulation of 38 years of marriage, where we'd put aside $5 or $10 whenever we could, where we'd clipped coupons and mended clothes instead of buying new ones. It was supposed to be my security blanket, my independence in old age, the money that would keep me from being a burden to anyone. But mothers don't think about themselves first. We just don't. It's not in our nature, and maybe that's our greatest strength and our most fatal weakness. I drove to the First National Bank that afternoon, my hands trembling as I signed the withdrawal paperwork. The building still smelled like the lemon furniture polish they'd used since I was a young woman opening my first checking account. The teller, a young woman named Jessica with kind eyes and a gentle voice, looked genuinely concerned as she processed my request. "Mrs. Ellison, are you sure about this withdrawal? It's quite substantial, and I'd hate for you to make a decision you might regret later." "I'm helping my son," I said, straightening my shoulders the way I'd learned to do when life demanded more strength than I felt I possessed. "He's in trouble, and that's what mothers do. We help." Jessica nodded, but I caught her glancing at my account balance before printing the cashier's check. She probably saw women like me every day. Elderly widows cleaned out by family members who saw their bank accounts as emergency funds rather than hard-earned security. When I handed David the cashier's check that evening, His relief was so profound that tears streamed down his weathered face. He'd gotten his father's strong jaw, but my sensitive eyes, and seeing him cry always undid me completely. Karen, his wife of 18 years, hugged me so tight I could smell her expensive perfume and feel her genuine gratitude. "You're an angel, Martha," she whispered against my ear. "You saved us. We'll pay you back every penny, I promise. Every single penny." I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. For the next few months, everything seemed perfect in a way that should have made me suspicious. David got a promotion at Phillips Petroleum, where he'd worked in middle management for 12 years. His new title came with a company car and a small raise, though nothing like the salary increase his increased responsibilities deserved. Karen started a small catering business from their spacious kitchen, making elegant appetizers for ladies' luncheons and anniversary parties. Their house, the house I'd saved, buzzed with activity and purpose. They invited me for Sunday dinners every week, and we'd sit around their granite countertops, the same expensive surfaces I'd helped preserve from foreclosure, talking about the future with the kind of optimism that only comes after narrowly avoiding disaster. Emma, 16 and beautiful with her father's dark hair and her mother's ambitious spirit, would tell me about her college plans. Jake, 13 and still sweet enough to hug his grandmother without embarrassment, would show me his latest drawings, intricate sketches of superheroes and dragons that reminded me so much of his father's childhood creativity. "We're thinking about having another baby," Karen announced one evening in late summer, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. The announcement came during dessert, my homemade peach cobbler that had been Frank's favorite. "We feel like our family isn't quite complete yet." "That's wonderful," I said, though something in her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the words in front of a mirror. They already had 2 teenagers who were expensive in the way that modern children always are, with their designer clothes and electronic devices and endless activities that required constant transportation and financial support. It was David who planted the first seed of what was coming, speaking casually while we cleared dishes and loaded their dishwasher. "You know, Mom, this house is getting pretty crowded, with the kids getting older, needing their own space, wanting more privacy." I nodded, not understanding where this conversation was leading, not recognizing the careful way he was choosing his words. "We've been thinking," Karen chimed in, appearing at his elbow with the timing of a well-rehearsed performance. "Maybe it's time for us to downsize. Find something more manageable." The word hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, acrid and suffocating. Manageable. I was 74 years old, living alone in my modest 2-bedroom house 15 minutes away, the same house where I'd raised David and nursed Frank through his final illness. I maintained my own garden, paid my own bills, drove myself to church and grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. How exactly was I not manageable? But I smiled and nodded, because that's what mothers do. We make ourselves small so our children can feel big. We swallow our questions so they don't have to provide uncomfortable answers. The changes started subtly, the way erosion works on Oklahoma farmland. So gradual you don't notice until the damage is irreversible. Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month, then whenever it was convenient for everyone's schedule. When I called, conversations grew shorter, punctuated by distractions and interruptions. "We're just so busy, Mom. You understand. Karen's business is really taking off, and David's got this new project at work that's consuming all his time. The kids have so many activities. You know how it is." I did understand. I understood that I was becoming inconvenient, an obligation rather than a joy, a duty rather than a choice. The morning I discovered the true extent of their continuing financial troubles, I was helping Karen organize her home office. It was a Tuesday in September, and she'd asked me to help her sort through paperwork for her catering business. She'd stepped out to sign for a delivery, leaving her laptop open on the desk where she'd been working on what she called her financial planning. I didn't mean to look. I've never been the kind of person who snoops through other people's private business. But the spreadsheet was right there on the screen, impossible to ignore, with columns of numbers that told a story I hadn't expected to read. Even after I'd cleared their mortgage, they owed nearly $50,000 to various creditors. Credit cards, personal loans, the line of credit they'd opened to start Karen's catering business. The business that was supposedly taking off was actually losing money every month, despite Karen's optimistic reports. David's promotion had come with longer hours and more responsibility, but the raise was modest at best, nowhere near enough to keep pace with their spending habits. They were drowning again, but this time they hadn't asked for help. They hadn't even told me they were struggling. That night, I lay in Frank's old spot on our wedding quilt, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of our 45-year-old house. He'd been gone 3 years, but I still reached for him in moments like these, still turned to share the day's worries with the empty space where his warm presence used to be. "What should I do, honey?" I whispered to the darkness. "What would you tell me to do?" The answer came to me with painful clarity, delivered in Frank's voice as clearly as if he were lying beside me. They didn't want my help anymore. They wanted my absence. They wanted to solve their problems without involving the old woman who'd already given too much and might ask uncomfortable questions about where the money was going. I should have seen it coming. The way Karen's smile never quite reached her eyes when I arrived unannounced. How David always seemed to be checking his phone when we talked, as if he were waiting for a more important call. The way my grandchildren treated me like a stranger who happened to share their DNA, polite but distant, answering my questions with one-word responses before escaping to their rooms. But the morning I came home to an empty house, I wasn't prepared for the brutal completeness of their abandonment. I'd gone to Miller's grocery store, the same family-owned market where I'd shopped for 40 years, planning to buy ingredients for my famous pot roast for Sunday dinner. It was October, and the Oklahoma air carried that crisp promise of winter, the kind of weather that makes you want to cook something warm and comforting for the people you love. I'd been humming while I shopped, thinking about how Emma's face always lit up when she tasted my cornbread, about how Jake would sneak extra helpings of mashed potatoes when he thought no one was looking. The first sign that something was wrong was David's red pickup truck missing from the driveway. Not particularly unusual. He often ran errands on Saturday mornings, picking up supplies for weekend projects or groceries that Karen had forgotten during the week. But when I walked through the front door using the key they'd given me years ago, the silence felt different, heavier, final. "David?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the space. "Karen? Kids?" Nothing. Not even the usual background noise of teenagers playing music or watching television. I walked through their house, the house I'd saved from foreclosure, room by empty room. The living room furniture was gone. The family photos that had lined the hallway, including the professional portraits I'd paid for last Christmas, had disappeared. Even the magnets from Emma's honor roll certificates and Jake's soccer team schedules had been stripped from the refrigerator, leaving behind only the faint outlines where they'd hung for years. In the master bedroom, all that remained was a single envelope on the bare hardwood floor, positioned in the exact center of the room, like a period at the end of a sentence. My name was written across the front in Karen's careful cursive handwriting, the same script she'd used to write thank you notes after their wedding. "Dear Martha," it began, and my hands shook as I read the words that would change everything. "We've decided to make a fresh start in Tulsa. David got a transfer with Phillips, a wonderful opportunity that we couldn't pass up. We felt it was best for our family to have some space to grow and establish our independence. Thank you for everything you've done for us over the years. We know how much you love us, and we love you too. We'll be in touch soon once we get settled. Love always, Karen and David." I read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated, before I could make sense of what had happened. They had moved. Not just moved out, but moved away, to another city 2 hours north, without telling me, without saying goodbye, without any acknowledgement that I might want to know where my son and grandchildren were living, that I might want their new address or phone number. Like I was a landlord they were trying to avoid, not the woman who had birthed and raised the man they'd built their life with, not the grandmother who had attended every school play and soccer game, who had bandaged scraped knees and celebrated birthdays and provided the down payment for their first car. I walked through every room again, slower this time, cataloging the completeness of their departure. In Jake's old bedroom, I found a stuffed elephant I'd given him for his 8th birthday, abandoned in the closet like something they hadn't had room to pack. The elephant's fur was matted from years of love, one ear chewed by their old dog, the kind of beloved toy that should never be left behind. In Emma's room, my hands shook as I picked up a drawing she'd made in second grade. A crayon masterpiece of our family, holding hands under a rainbow. I was in the center of the picture, my gray hair carefully colored with a silver crayon, my smile wide and happy. The words, "I love Grandma," were written in careful block letters across the bottom. That drawing had been taped to their refrigerator for 6 years, a constant reminder of childhood love and family bonds. Now it was crumpled on the floor like trash, forgotten in their hurry to escape. I sat on the living room floor, in the exact spot where their leather sectional had been positioned, and I cried. Not the gentle tears of sadness or disappointment, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who has been completely and utterly discarded. I cried for every sacrifice I'd made silently over the years, for every time I'd put their needs before my own health, my own security, my own dreams. For every moment, I'd convinced myself that love meant making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding. I cried for the grandmother who would miss birthdays and graduations, who wouldn't know if her grandchildren were sick or sad or celebrating achievements. I cried for the mother who had raised a son capable of such casual cruelty, such breathtaking selfishness. The neighbors probably heard me. Mrs. Henderson next door had always been kind, always waved when she saw me working in David's garden or bringing over casseroles when Karen was too busy with her catering business to cook. But I was beyond caring about appearances, beyond worrying about what anyone might think of the old woman sobbing alone in an empty house. When the tears finally stopped, I was left with something I hadn't felt in years: absolute clarity. The kind of clear-eyed understanding that comes only after you've been stripped of all illusions, all hopeful self-deception. I called my lawyer Monday morning. Richard Morrison had handled Frank's estate and had always been refreshingly direct with me, never patronizing or dismissive despite my age and gender. His office smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place where serious business got done with handshakes and integrity. "Martha," he said after I explained the situation, his weathered face grave with concern, "legally, since you paid off their mortgage, you have significant rights to this property. They can't just abandon it and expect you to handle the financial and legal consequences." "What consequences? Property taxes, homeowners insurance, general maintenance, liability issues if someone gets hurt on the property. Someone has to be legally responsible for this house, and right now, that someone appears to be you." The legal paperwork took 6 weeks to sort through, but by early December, the house was officially mine. David had signed a quitclaim deed years ago as collateral for my initial loan, something his lawyer had insisted on, just as a formality, to protect everyone's interests. That forgotten formality was now my salvation, my unexpected second chance. I could have sold the house immediately. The real estate market was strong, and the 4-bedroom colonial would have fetched a price that could have restored my savings and provided comfortable security for my remaining years. But as I walked through those empty rooms in the weeks that followed, dusting and cleaning and gradually reclaiming the space, a different idea began to form in my mind. I'd always loved books with the kind of passion some people reserve for religion or politics. Frank used to joke that I read more than I breathed, that I'd rather spend money on novels than groceries. Our little house was packed with stories, mysteries and romances, biographies and poetry collections, classic literature and contemporary fiction. Shelves in every room groaned under the weight of words, and I knew each book like an old friend. I dreamed once, long ago, of opening a bookstore. It was a fantasy I'd entertained during the early years of my marriage, when David was small and I was hungry for intellectual stimulation beyond nursery rhymes and cartoon shows. But life happened the way it always does. Marriage, motherhood, Frank's job transfers, the endless responsibilities of keeping a family fed and housed and healthy. Now I was 74 years old, alone, and suddenly in possession of a 4-bedroom house with an open floor plan, large windows that let in beautiful natural light, and rooms that begged to be filled with stories and the people who love them. The conversion took 3 months and most of my remaining savings. I hired Gonzalez Construction, a local family business known for quality work and fair prices. Miguel Gonzalez, the owner, had daughters my grandchildren's age, and he understood what I was trying to build without my having to explain the loneliness that drove the project. We knocked down the wall between the living room and dining room, creating a spacious area for bookshelves and comfortable reading chairs. The formal dining room became a cozy cafe area with small tables and a counter where I could serve coffee and homemade pastries. We installed proper lighting, the kind that makes reading a pleasure rather than a strain, and built-in shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. The master bedroom became my small but comfortable apartment, just enough space for me, with a compact kitchenette, a sitting area, and a window that looked out over the garden I was already planning to restore. I didn't need much space. I'd learned that happiness doesn't require square footage, just purpose and the freedom to pursue it. Ellison's Books and More opened on a gray Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after David's desperate phone call had started this entire journey. The More included the cafe area where I served coffee and tea, homemade cookies and muffins, and a corner dedicated to local crafts made by other women my age whose talents the world seemed determined to overlook. Mavis Jenkins brought her hand-knitted scarves and baby blankets. Dorothy Schmidt contributed her pressed flower bookmarks and greeting cards. Ruth Williams, whose husband had died the same year as Frank, displayed her painted birdhouses and wooden signs with inspirational sayings. I didn't advertise much, couldn't afford a big marketing campaign, even if I'd wanted one. But word spread the way it does in small Oklahoma towns, carried on the wind like dandelion seeds, taking root in unexpected places. People came curious and stayed because the place felt like home, real home, not the carefully curated version that looks perfect in magazines, but feels empty of genuine warmth. Mrs. Henderson was my first official customer, arriving at 9:15 that opening morning with a warm smile and genuine enthusiasm. She bought a romance novel by an author she'd never tried and stayed for 2 hours, reading in the burgundy armchair by the front window while sipping coffee and watching the early spring rain. "This is lovely, Martha," she said before leaving. "It feels like peace, like the kind of place where you can breathe deeply and remember who you used to be before life got so complicated." Peace. That's exactly what it was. The kind of deep, soul-settling peace I hadn't experienced in years. The days settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected to love so completely. I opened at 9 each morning, greeting the early customers who stopped for coffee and a quick browse before heading to work. Retired teachers came in the afternoons, gravitating toward the biography section and lingering to share stories about former students and the changes they'd witnessed in education over the decades. Teenagers discovered the young adult section and created an informal book club that met every Thursday evening, discussing dystopian novels and romance series with the kind of passionate intensity only teenagers can muster. Young mothers brought their toddlers for story time on Saturday mornings, grateful for a place where children were welcomed rather than merely tolerated. I was part of a community again, but this time, I wasn't trying to earn my place through sacrifice or prove my worth through what I could provide. I was valued for what I offered: comfort, conversation, the perfect book recommendation, a listening ear without judgment. 3 months after opening, on a Wednesday evening when spring rain was drumming against the windows and the book club was debating the merits of a popular vampire romance, David called. I was shelving returns, organizing the fiction section that seemed to rearrange itself daily based on customer preferences, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I'd learned to love the quiet evenings when the store was closed and I could work at my own pace without interruption. But something made me pick up. Perhaps the same instinct that had carried me through decades of motherhood. "Mom?" His voice was smaller than I remembered, tentative in a way that reminded me of the little boy who used to call for me during thunderstorms. "Hello, David. We heard about the bookstore from Mrs. Henderson's daughter who saw it on Facebook. She said it's really something special." I waited, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch between us like a bridge he'd have to choose to cross. "Mom, we need to talk. About what happened, about the house, about everything. What would you like to talk about?" A long pause, filled with the sound of his breathing, and what might have been tears. "We were struggling, Mom. Financially, emotionally, everything was falling apart. Karen was having panic attacks about the debt, and I was working 16-hour days trying to keep up with the new position. We felt trapped, suffocated," Karen thought. "We thought maybe if we had some distance, some space to figure things out without feeling like we were constantly disappointing you." So you figured it out by disappearing? We were going to call once we got settled. When? It's been 8 months, David. 8 months without a word. Without knowing if my grandchildren were safe or sick or needed anything from their grandmother. Another pause, longer this time. We want to come see you, to explain properly, to try to make things right. I looked around my bookstore, at the comfortable chairs filled with people reading, at the local artwork hanging on the walls, at the life I'd built from the ashes of my discarded love. A life that was wholly mine, built on my terms, sustained by relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or need. I don't think that's a good idea, I said quietly. Mom, please, we're family. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we're still family. Family doesn't abandon family, David. Family doesn't move away like thieves in the night from someone who sacrificed everything for them. Family doesn't leave stuffed animals and children's drawings on the floor like garbage. But Mom, I need to go. I have customers who need my attention. I hung up and stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the phone, waiting for the familiar guilt to wash over me, for the maternal instinct to override my anger and hurt. Instead, I felt something unexpected and liberating. Relief. That evening, as I locked the front door and turned off the lights, climbing the stairs to my small apartment above the store, I realized something profound. For the first time in 74 years, I was living entirely for myself, not as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's convenient solution to a problem. Just as Martha, a woman who loved books and coffee, who enjoyed helping customers find exactly the story they needed, who had learned that dignity doesn't come from others, but from within. The sunset painted the Oklahoma sky in familiar shades of rose and gold, and I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into my favorite chair with a novel I'd been meaning to read. The protagonist was a woman my age who had decided to travel the world after her husband died, discovering courage she'd never known she possessed. As I read about her adventures in Paris cafes and Italian vineyards, I found myself smiling and wondering what other adventures might be waiting for me. Maybe I'd travel too someday. Maybe I'd take a cooking class or learn to paint. Maybe I'd write my own story instead of just selling other people's. David tried calling twice more over the following weeks. I let the calls go to voicemail, listening to his increasingly desperate messages, but not responding. Karen sent a long letter, 5 pages of careful explanations about their situation, and how they'd always planned to include me in their new life once they got settled in Tulsa. She mentioned the grandchildren missing me, David's regret about the way they'd handled things, their hope that we could rebuild our relationship on a healthier foundation. I read the letter once, carefully, then placed it in the recycling bin beside my desk. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ashes. Some relationships, once betrayed, can't be reconstructed no matter how pretty the apologies sound. The bookstore thrived in ways I'd never imagined possible. We hosted poetry readings featuring local writers, craft workshops led by the women whose work we sold, and story times for children that drew families from 3 surrounding towns. I started a book club for widows that met every Wednesday evening, and we called ourselves the Chapter 2 Club, women who were writing new stories for themselves after decades of living for others. Gradually, I began to understand that my son's abandonment hadn't been the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter I might never have been brave enough to write otherwise. The women in my book club understood this in a way that younger people couldn't. We'd all learned, sometimes too late, that loving someone doesn't require losing yourself, that sacrifice without appreciation becomes martyrdom, and that the most important relationship you can nurture is the one with your own dreams and possibilities. On quiet Tuesday afternoons, when rain drummed against the windows and the store was empty except for 1 or 2 dedicated readers lost in their books, I sometimes thought about the life I'd lived before. The decades of putting everyone else's needs first, of measuring my worth by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice without complaint. I didn't regret loving David or helping him when he needed it. Love isn't something you can or should regret, even when it's thrown back in your face. But I regretted making myself so small that I'd almost disappeared entirely. Regretted believing that my value lay only in what I could provide rather than who I was as a person with my own interests, dreams, and rights to happiness. Now, Surrounded by stories and people who chose to be there, who valued my opinions and sought my company, I was visible again. Not as someone's mother or wife or financial savior, but as Martha, the woman who made the best coffee in 3 counties, who always knew exactly which book would speak to your current situation, who listened without judgment and offered wisdom earned through experience rather than textbooks. The red dirt of Oklahoma still got under my fingernails when I worked in the garden behind the store, planting herbs for the tea I served and flowers to brighten the reading patio I'd created. The wheat fields still turned gold every summer, and the thunderstorms still rolled across the plains with magnificent power. But now, I saw these familiar sights through different eyes, not as the backdrop to someone else's story, but as the setting for my own second chapter. And it was turning out to be the best chapter yet. 10 months after opening the bookstore, on a crisp October morning that reminded me painfully of the day I discovered the empty house, I received an unexpected visitor. Emma, my granddaughter, now 17 and taller than I remembered, stood nervously in the doorway of Ellison's Books and More, her dark hair longer and her face more mature, but still achingly familiar. "Grandma Martha," she said, her voice uncertain, as if she wasn't sure I'd want to see her. My heart jumped and raced, but I kept my voice steady, professional. "Emma, I drove down from Tulsa by myself. I got my license last month, and I've been saving money from my part-time job." She looked around the store with wide, wondering eyes. "This is incredible. I had no idea you'd done something like this." I poured her a cup of coffee. She was old enough now, almost an adult, and we sat in the reading nook by the front window, afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass and illuminating the dust motes that danced between us like memories. She told me about school, about her college applications and her plans to study journalism, about how different life had been since the move to Tulsa. She spoke carefully, as if she were walking through a minefield, unsure which topics might explode into pain or anger. "Dad talks about you sometimes," she said quietly, staring into her coffee cup. "He seems different, sadder. He and Mom fight more now, about money and other things. Jake doesn't talk much anymore, just stays in his room playing video games." "People make choices," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Then they live with the consequences." "I missed you," she said suddenly, tears starting to form in eyes that looked exactly like David's had at her age. "I missed your stories and your cooking, and the way you always remembered what I was worried about and checked on me later. I missed having someone who thought I was special just for being me." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I reached across the small table and took her hand, noting how much it had grown, how her fingers were long and graceful like a pianist's. "I missed you too, sweetheart. More than you know. Could I come visit sometimes? On weekends, maybe? I have a car now, and I could drive down Saturday mornings and help in the store, or just spend time with you." I looked at this young woman who had been brave enough to drive 2 hours to find me, who had chosen to bridge a gap that her parents had created through their own selfishness and cowardice. Emma wasn't responsible for their choices, and she didn't deserve to lose her grandmother because of their failures. "This will always be your home, Emma. Always. You're welcome here anytime you want to come." She stayed until evening, helping me shelve books and listening to stories about the customers who had become friends, about the book clubs and the poetry readings and the life I'd built from nothing but determination and a dream I'd thought was too late to pursue. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "I'm proud of you, Grandma, for this place, for starting over, for making something beautiful out of something terrible." As I watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the Oklahoma darkness, I realized that sometimes love does find a way to circle back, even when you think it's lost forever. Not the conditional love that requires constant sacrifice and silent suffering, but the pure kind that sees you for who you are and chooses you anyway, that values your presence more than your presence. I locked the door and turned off the lights, climbing the familiar stairs to my apartment. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, new moments of connection with people who had chosen to be part of my life rather than simply taking what I offered and moving on when it was convenient. Tonight, I would read and sip tea and be grateful for the courage I'd found to choose myself, to value my own dreams and dignity enough to pursue them, even when it meant disappointing the people I'd spent decades trying to please. The Oklahoma sky stretched wide and dark outside my bedroom window, filled with stars that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop looking down long enough to see them shining.